going to abide by today. The session is going to run in two main parts. First, we're going to have Minister Godongwana's keynote address, followed by a few questions if time allows. And then we're going to have a facilitated panel discussion with our esteemed panelists that I will introduce them properly as we begin the session. But we have Fiona Tregenna, who is one of the editors of the book, Trudy Makaya, who is with the presidency, and Richard Kozul Wright, who is with UNCTAD. The audience can post questions in the chat below for the panelists and the minister, and I will do my best to incorporate these into the discussion and the follow-up questions for the minister. But I'm not able to guarantee that we will cover all the questions that you have. If there are other issues that we don't get to address, please feel free to send your queries to the email address that will be posted in the chat, and someone will respond to you. Also to make a note that there will be another event, a conference in October, where we will deal with some of the issues that are discussed and engaged with by the book in far much more detail. The book is available for free on the Oxford University Press website. If you are able to click on the open access link, you should be able to access a PDF version of the book. You can, of course, purchase a hard copy from most of the resellers of the book. And now to move beyond the housekeeping and to start with the more content and the more interesting issues that we will be dealing with today. When we conceived or started working on the book, I think it was before the pandemic, and already at that point, South Africa's performance was a big concern, and there were big questions about how to place South Africa on a different trajectory, a trajectory that would allow for more sustained growth, a trajectory that would allow for greater inclusion and more shared, to be able to share the benefits of the growth of the economy that we've seen. And as part of trying to answer that problem, we then started working on the book as the editors. While we were working on the book, we then had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has placed greater importance on having economies that are sustainable and economies that are able to provide shared outcomes for everyone that live in it. So I think this is the right time for the book to come out in order to offer some detailed evidence analysis, as well as recommendations and policy ideas on how South Africa, as well as other middle-income countries, can escape the middle-income trap and get onto a path of sustained growth. Before we start with a deep dive discussion of the book with the panelists, we are going to have the keynote address by the minister. We are very privileged to have with us today the Honourable Minister of Finance, Minister Enoch Godongwana, and he will speak to us now for a few minutes, and we will be able to engage more deeply with the conversations following his address. Minister.
Thank you, Program Director. Let the contributors and editor of the book, in particular you, Pamela, Antonio, Simon Roberts, who I happen to know well, Fiona, who I also happen to know well. Let me just make an apology. I just stepped out of another meeting. There's too many meetings in government. I've just stepped out of another cabinet committee. I may have to run back. I'm not running away from questions. If I can find time, I'll join the panelist again. Also, unlike those who got the book free of charge, when I heard of it, I bought it at the time at Amazon. It was $85 US. So I was not fortunate like all of you who got it free. But nevertheless, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this special occasion when we are launching this groundbreaking academic work by some of our country's finest researchers and economic thought leaders. As a government that strives to make decisions on the basis of evidence and decisions informed by results of rigorous scientific inquiry, we value high quality research that help us respond to pressing challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Our reality is that the current state of South African economy is unsustainable. Real GDP per capita has been declining since 2015. What that means, as South Africans, we've been becoming poorer since 2015. Productivity growth has been slow and appears to be slowing down further. And the unemployment rate has recently increased to a record high of 34.4%. Part of our policy response requires that we place emphasis on fundamental transforming the structure of our economy to move from low growth, low labor absorbing sectors to sectors of high growth, high productivity, and greater labor absorption. Our focus must also be on how do we upgrade to higher value-added activities within sectors. If we can do this, we stand a greater chance of catapulting our economy onto a path of inclusive growth, sustainability, and global competitiveness. The body of work we're launching today will no doubt strengthen our response, in particular to the challenges we face in our quest for greater and inclusive industrial development. Over the years, South Africa has made some progress towards attaining structural transformation in pursuit of faster, inclusive, and sustainable growth. However, as it is asserted in the book, this progress has been discontinuous and uneven. We know from economic literature that industrialization, in the structural sense of shifting resources into industries and particularly into manufacturing, has come to be closely identified with persistent faster levels of economic growth and development. Until well into the 20th century, those countries that were industrialized would also be those countries with the relatively high proportions of output and workforce attributable to industry and in particular manufacturing. From this, we learn that countries that succeed in making the structural shift to industry and manufacturing would have met the necessary and sufficient condition for higher and sustained levels of growth and development. Put differently, development is intimately linked to industrial production. I'm raising all of this background, which you all know, because for me, one of the outstanding features of the volume of work we're launching today is that it is putting industrial policy at the quest for industrialization back at the center of the development agenda, where I think it belongs. Over the years, South Africa has experienced significant deindustrialization. Some may argue, though, that it's not deindustrialization, but a substantial growth in other sectors. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. From a high of around 22% of GDP in the late 1980s to the late 1990s, manufacturing now contributes around 12% of GDP. In addition, the manufacturing sector's capital base has shrunk from roughly about 677 billion in 2008 to currently 545, or roundedly, can round it to 546 billion in real terms. These numbers speak of the dissemination of our industrial base. They also speak of the significant job losses, widening income inequality, and poverty. The decline in manufacturing has been met by rapid and significant growth across a range of service sectors. As from the 1900s, while the contribution of other key sectors such as mining, agriculture, and manufacturing were either declining or flat, the service sector became the main source of growth. The sector now makes up about 65% of GDP, 62% of employment, and 74% of capital formation. The growth of the service sector is driven in the main by credit-fueled consumption and import intensity. Talking of the import intensity of our economy, I often make the point that even in an environment of growth, however small it may be, our economy continues to suck imports. This is in part because of a weak industrial base. This is also a reflection of an imbalanced growth model, which is unsustainable and keeps our economy vulnerable. For instance, during the commodity boom of the late 1990s and early 2000s, we were unable to optimize the opportunity presented by the boom to effect structural changes, which would have allowed us to translate the boom into sustainable growth and development. Manufacturing has strong backward and forward linkages to the rest of the economy, which makes it a significant driver of demand across the economy. Equally, the sector's ability to interface between agrarian and resource extracting economies and introduce new products and technology allows it to move the economy forward from low to high productivity activities. Further, in an environment such as ours, where structural unemployment remains stubbornly high, manufacturing has a critical role to play in expanding our skills base, helping us deal with unemployment. Ultimately, the point we are making is that industrial development is critical for our aspirations as a nation for higher levels of economic growth, job creation, transformation, and development. Structural transformation also has development implications in that it contributes to promoting and maintaining a competitive economic environment that helps firms to grow and produce profitably. There's an argument in the book, in particular by, I think, is Nimrod, that macroeconomic policy has not been supportive of industrial policy. Our point of departure is that macroeconomic policy can never be passive in relation to industrial policy. To us, fiscal policy is a powerful instrument capable of influencing and shaping the orientation and structure of the economy. It is not just the allocation of resources that matters, but also the market structure, institutions, and sectors that are enforced or transformed as a result of the deployment of fiscal resources. In addition, the composition of government spending matters for both the pace and the quality of growth. We are of the view that government expenditure should complement and enable rather than substitute for production in the private economy. Essentially, structural transformation is about building a competitive economy that participates effectively in global and regional value chains. Fiscal policy has a feedback loop that can drive competitiveness, making it an enabler of competitiveness. For instance, the pace and scale of infrastructure rollout, which is an outcome of an effectiveness of the use of fiscal resources, has a significant impact on the competitiveness of local firms and the ability of their products to access global value and supply chains. Equally, investment in new technologies, innovation, health, education, training, upskilling of the workforce, all of which are linked to the outcomes of fiscal policy, also have a direct bearing on competitiveness and inclusion. Another example of that is the pace of the vaccine rollout program has profound implications on the ability of our economy and industries to operate at full capacity. Further proof that the conduct or the deployment of fiscal resources cannot be detached from the goal of enhancing the economy's productive capabilities is the work we're doing through the Operation Vulindlela. Through Operation Vulindlela, we're implementing macroeconomic interventions which we deem as building blocks towards structural transformation. Ultimately, these interventions are aimed at boosting investment, trade, innovation, skills development, breaking barriers to entry, as well as enhancing competitiveness and economic inclusion. Part of what industrial policy seeks to achieve is greater trade and export diversification, especially diversification to higher value-added exports. Linked to this is the fact that as a country, we have always placed increased trade or export-led growth at the heart of our industrial and economic policy. I must qualify this thing lest somebody criticize me. We have placed it export-led growth among others, not as the only one. I want to qualify because when we're dealing with this setting up the RDP, this debate was more profound. So it's export-led growth amongst others. Accordingly, the kind of export intensity we must pursue should include greater integration of our manufactured products into global value chains, with particular emphasis on value chains within SADC and the African continent. This we must do in order to take advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, as well as economic linkages and flows between sectors, firms, and geographic locations on our continent. Also of importance is need to strive for policy coherence and certainty across the economy. In this regard, significant progress is being made towards ensuring greater policy and regulatory certainty in important sectors of the economy, such as water and sanitation, energy and telecommunication. Linked to this is the work we are doing to strengthen the capacity of the state, not only to implement policy, but also to intervene in the economy in a manner that does not hinder, but enhances industrial growth and development. Strengthening the capacity of the state to implement policy draws on particular significance since South Africa does not suffer a paucity of policy documents, policy position, and pronouncement. We often say that our problem is not the absence of policies, but rather is the implementation of policies. Emphasis must also be placed on ensuring alignment of policies. Currently, our government, working together with social partners at Network, is implementing the economic recovery, reconstruction and recovery plan announced by the president in October last year. One of the pillars of this plan is industrialization and growing the productive economy. Through this pillar, we are intervening decisively to drive strategic localization, repurpose South Africa's manufacturing, as well as strengthen regional and global trade. Ultimately, our goal is to significantly increase South Africa's manufacturing output, reduce the proportion of imported intermediate and finished goods, and expand the capacity of local suppliers. As we do this, we are aware that over time, our manufacturing firms have been struggling to build their productive capabilities, to diversify their production activities, embrace new technologies, develop their domestic supply chains. This has contributed to many of our manufacturing firms remaining uncompetitive and thus unable to be part of the global value chains. This is an area that requires ongoing attention. As I conclude, I wish to quote from the book, and I quote, "Countries that have attained middle-income status, like South Africa, face a number of challenges, in particular, linking up to global value chains while linking back into their domestic economies and keeping pace with technological change. These and developing countries are more generally are looking at industrialization and industrial policy as ways of addressing these challenges, escaping premature deindustrialization and changing the structural and institutional configuration of their economies towards higher productivity activities. Indeed, structural transformation and industrial policy are returning to the forefront of national policy debates. We welcome this development. We believe that structural transformation should be placed at the heart of the economic development agenda. We therefore welcome the publication of this body of work, which we also see as a timely intervention, presenting a new ideas and strategies required to unblock long-standing economic challenges which have gripped South African economy for decades. To the team, we say, well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Godongwana, for that speech, and thank you very much for making the time to participate in the launch of this volume. I think it's very encouraging to hear that industrial policy, not only superficially, but understanding the importance of building capabilities for sustained growth is something that you and your team are thinking about. We welcome the reference to the structural reforms and the emphasis of industrialization in that. We would like in future, of course, to see the detail behind that industrialization aspect, as the documents at the moment are still a relatively high level. Minister, there are a few questions for you. However, we do note that you've indicated that you need to leave to another meeting. So perhaps what we'll do is that we will move on to the panel discussion. And if you are able to rejoin us a little later before the session closed, then we can address some of the questions that participants have been putting forward for you in particular. Thank you. Okay, so I think he has gone. Trudy, Richard, and Fiona, would you please switch your cameras on as we start the second session of the panel? I think, the minister has had some really kind words to say about the book, and we appreciate this as the editors, but also I'm sure the contributors to the book who've spent quite a lot of time finalizing and wrapping up the book would also appreciate this. But we've also seen some great endorsements of the book, I think, which we really appreciate, which all emphasize the contribution, the timeliness of the contribution of this book, as well as raising the issues about the important role of industrialization. Later on, I will mention the various people that have endorsed the book, but it's the likes of Hajun Chan from Cambridge, Richard Kozul, Wright, and Trudy Makaya, who join us today, Chilizu Marwala from the University of Johannesburg, Imran Valodia from Wits University, and many others that we will get to in the later part of the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce a little more formally the panelists that we have for this session. On behalf of the editors, we have Fiona Tregenna, who is the NRF chair for the NRF South African Chair for Industrial Development in South Africa. We've got Trudy Makaya, who is economic advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa. And we've got Richard Kozul Wright, Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, commonly referred to as UNCTAD. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the session. And hi to our late joiner over there. I think to kick us off, Fiona, perhaps you could just start us off by telling us, the gap that the book seeks to fill, as well as the key insights that are coming from the book.
Thanks, Pam. Well, through the volume, what we're really trying to do is to set out an agenda for what we might term the real transformation of the economy. Something which is aimed at sustained and sustainable prosperity, at increased economic participation, and overall at social and economic resilience. So the overall theme of the book, as can be seen from the title and the remarks of the minister, is structural transformation, referring to really changing the composition of the economy towards activities that have superior scope for sustained productivity growth. While manufacturing remains central to this, including for the reasons that the minister so eloquently set out around the importance of manufacturing and industrialization, It's also important to recognize that moving to a path of sustained growth and catching up requires investment in productive capabilities across sectors, including in agriculture and services. So while the volume has a particular focus on manufacturing, for example, the chapter by Shingi Chisora Dube and Chris Kramer provides an interesting case study of fruit exports. Internationally, I think we can see that the new global drivers of change, in particular digital industrialization, global value chain consolidation, and sustainability management, not only present risks, but have actually opened windows of opportunities for structural transformation across middle-income countries. But leveraging these potential opportunities requires new ways of thinking. Politically, it requires the building of supportive coalitions, and it requires agile policy making. And we hope that the analysis in the book at least contributes to an evidence base for this. Issues of political economy, I think, underpin many of the case studies and other analysis in the book. And political economy issues are explored in various chapters, including those on power and inequality, on BEE and barriers to entry, and on political settlements and industrial policy. Obviously, there's a range of themes explored in the 15 chapters of the book, and I'm really trying to pull out a few highlights in this 5-minute input. But I guess 4 of the key themes that perhaps cut across many of these chapters include, firstly, learning and the strengthening of productive capabilities. Then secondly, a set of issues around technical and technological change, digitalization and sustainability. And then thirdly, a number of the chapters deal with global value chains and associated power dynamics. And then lastly, political economy and the role of the state, without which we can't really meaningfully analyze these cases or look towards what needs to be done. So analytically, I think many of the chapters in the volume identify some of the key limitations of South Africa's growth path, really associated with the failure of thoroughgoing structural transformation. So overall, we discern that there's been limited collaboration for learning and for building capabilities. So as a result, there hasn't really been the kind and the scale of investment and of effort required for the complex processes of both adopting and adapting technology for capability building across related activities in industrial ecosystems. So whilst, of course, there have been exceptions, on the whole, firms have largely struggled to build their productive capabilities and to diversify and upgrade their production activities, and really to develop strong and sustained growth-pulling domestic linkages. And given the weakening of the industrial base, the kind of engagements which there have been with GVCs and with the emerging technologies of the 4R have largely been limited and haven't, up until this point, really delivered the desired outcomes on a systemic basis. And in the volume, these sort of themes are explored in different ways, including through case studies of the value chains in metals and machinery, in plastics and in the auto industries. So looking globally, we can observe that successful industrializers internationally have successfully been able to manage the processes of international integration and building domestic linkages in local clusters of deepening capabilities. But in South Africa, whilst it's happened in certain cases, it hasn't really been the case across the board. So there have been islands of excellence, but overall, the analysis in the book identifies South Africa as being stuck in a middle-income technology trap with elements of premature deindustrialization. And that although the economy has been highly internationalized, the nature of the international integration hasn't sufficiently translated into substantial sustained growth in FDI and rapid growth and diversification of exports. In the book, we point to a set of what we call traps and gaps, which need to be avoided and overcome in acquiring advanced industrial capabilities for real structural transformation. And although I won't have time to go into the traps and gaps in detail, I think maybe it's just important to observe that these, they tend to compound each other and to have transversal effects across firms. So it's important that both analytically and with a policy lens, that we don't view firms in isolation, but rather as part of an industrial ecosystem of interdependent activities involving a range of multiple heterogeneous actors that actually need to cooperate, to compete, and to co-evolve to create a web of complementary capabilities that support innovation and continuous industrial renewal. So trying to sort of pull together across the 15 chapters of the book, 5 of the key lessons that I think emerge from it are firstly, in terms of kind of paths of industrialization, that the current and the ongoing premature deindustrialization needs to be arrested and reversed, and we need to pursue a strong path of structural transformation. Then secondly, the technological changes that are underway internationally and in South Africa with the digitalization of economic activities underscore once again the importance of developing an industrial ecosystem of firms with effective links to public institutions. And then thirdly, that achieving a more inclusive industrialization path, which has in some ways been dominated by powerful firms, requires dismantling barriers to entry, and so allowing a new system of accumulation to emerge. And then fourthly, in terms of political economy, that successful structural transformation depends fundamentally on a country's political settlement, and in particular, whether the coalitions of interests that potentially could support the organization of industries for long-term investments in capabilities hold sway, which hasn't sufficiently been the case up until this point. And lastly, the analysis really underscores the need for purposive and coordinated industrial policies. Happily, the minister also emphasized this, and we see these as being essential to achieving all of these goals and to improving the country's productivity and competitiveness, and providing the basis for what we've called a real transformation. So lastly, while the volume is, of course, focused on South Africa, we see South Africa as an important case study for many of the challenges which are faced by middle-income countries on other continents as well in pursuing structural transformation. So there are, of course, specificities and uniqueness in the case of South Africa, but there are also common challenges for other developing economies and particularly for other middle-income countries. So we hope that the volume will also be of broader interest beyond South Africa. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I think you did a really good job summarizing 400 pages into a few minutes. I'm noting the questions that are being put up in the chat, and we will come back to them later on in the discussion. Trudy, I think a few months ago, you wrote an opinion piece on how economic policy discourse in South Africa tends to focus more on the narrative and not on the substantive issues, and also the recommendations that people usually put out tend to lack the detail. What this book does is that it attempts to use evidence-based, looking at firm level, at industry level, and at sector level, to be able to build from the bottom up the kind of recommendations and policies that could be adopted to place South Africa on a different path. So I wanted to hear your views on what you think South African policymakers can take away from the book.
All right, thank you, Pam, and good afternoon to fellow panelists and to all who are on this video conference. I think this, book really is a very deep and detailed discussion on the challenge that we face at this level of development. I think what I was talking to in the piece that you mentioned is that often there are very catastrophizing narratives about South Africa. We're at the end of the road, there's no hope, investors are striking, and on and on and on, these negative narratives go. And they're not really talking to the realities where, yes, some things are going not so well, some things are going very badly, but there are also things that are going right. Now, clearly, the book does give a very comprehensive diagnosis of things that are really going wrong. So if we look around our growth trends and how we've diverged from the rest of the world since about the 1970s, there's a chapter, I think it's the chapter 11 by Fiona and sorry.
Trudy, are you still there? She may be experiencing some technical difficulties. So perhaps I think while we wait for her to reconnect, we can move on and come back to the issues. I'm actually hoping that she'll come back now before we start discussing another question. Oh, okay. So she's completely off, and she will come back. I mean, I think we'll come back to the issue around what South African policymakers can take away from this. But while we wait for Trudy, I think, Richard, perhaps we can hear from you. I think Fiona mentions that the book is about South Africa, but it's South Africa as a case study of middle-income countries. Oh, Trudy, you're back.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know what happened. So I was talking about things that have gone wrong. So perhaps that's why I was being too negative.
Spectrum.
So there are lots of things that have gone wrong, right? But the book really challenges and says that, but there's a way forward. And many other countries have been here before and have been able to transcend this middle income trap. So we see many low income countries, but also middle income countries which have become upper middle income countries. So there's a path out of the trap. But the key lesson, I think, from the book is that there isn't a recipe which you can just pull off the shelf and say, this is how country X did it, and this is how we're going to follow the same path. It has to be specific to the realities of that country. We've done, when we look at a country from a resource base, there've been linkages that have been created, but it hasn't gone far enough. And some of the challenges we face in terms of market power, in terms of a very exclusionary economy, we've begun to deal with those, but we still have some way to go. I also like some of the novel directions in research that the book takes. So for instance, instead of talking about the middle income trap broadly, which we now fully understand, a country gets to a particular point, it struggles to grow into high income status. It also talks about the technology trap that is often a feature of this middle income trap, and how one can get out of that technology trap, and the kinds of learning and real investments that one has to take. Now, it raises very difficult questions for an under-resourced country. So as always, there are comparisons about South Africa versus other countries in terms of research and development, expenditure on innovation, the creation of patents, et cetera, and that's a very important agenda. But we're clearly lagging, and we also have to be realistic as to how far we can invest our resources into that kind of growth, and how much we can also invest into the growth that speaks more closely to our skills profile. And I think it's a dilemma that we constantly have to battle with. If we also look at the features of the technology trap, if one follows the logic, then there's also an understanding that you always want to move your economy into sectors of higher value addition, which comes with learning, with linkages, with growth. But in some instances, it also comes with a lot of displacement, and it also comes with less jobs intensity in those high productivity sectors. So once again, that's also a dilemma. We have to think about how do you upgrade and go up those value chains yet acknowledging that we have a very significant unemployment, problem. And so in some instances, being unproductive, using too much labor for a certain unit of output might be what we need in terms of our level of development, even though we know that the technological frontier would mean far less employed people for a unit of output. The book also has some interesting cautionary tales that we have to take real caution at this moment in the transitions that we face. So we face the digital transition. We also face the green transition occasioned by climate change. And there's really that interesting chapter that looks at the wine value chain in South Africa and how it's done all the right things in terms of sustainability and the green economy, getting all the fair trade certifications, increasing its sustainability, reducing resource use, and so being able to command a certain kind of premium in rich countries, especially Western markets, where those sustainability and other green features are valued. But unfortunately, a lot of that premium is not captured by the upstream producer, the wine producer, or the person who's harvesting the grapes, or even the wine producer. Most of the premium is captured by retail in the global north. And so there's a question as we look at the green transition in general about the distribution of benefits and costs, and how we should obviously respond to climate change. We should pursue green opportunities, but it's important where you land on that value chain, where we shouldn't reproduce the past. When we land on the lower end of that value chain, we do all the virtue signaling work and all the good things that gives us green stature, but the value is actually realized elsewhere. And I thought that was a very interesting case study that is on some level counterintuitive, but on another level, it's actually the same old story being repeated over and over again. But I do like the optimism that kind of suggests pathways. It's going to be a bit of a tricky pathway for us, because clearly we're not going to go the very low wage manufacturing route that was once the way to gain global market share. We're also not going to go the very highly skilled, highly productive approach, because that's not where our competitiveness is, that's not where our skills base is. And so we have to find, to craft a path that speaks to this. And there's an interesting chapter on agro-processing, on the industrialization of freshness, where we see value addition in agro-processing, in citrus exports, where across the board we see multiple parts of the value chain. The really primary agriculture is part of the story, but so is the refrigeration, the logistics, the services, the marketing, where South Africa can also participate and play. And that gives hope that you don't have to choose these really polarized development models. There's a way to bring it all together that speaks to our kind of middle income situation. So I found that quite encouraging. I think just to conclude, I saw a question around localization, and that's been an important theme of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. But I think it has to be seen that that is not an anti-trade stance. There's a way of thinking about localization where you do strategically choose areas where you want to focus, but that focus is about developing a domestic base where there's enough in the ecosystem to suggest that it should be happening in the country. But in our case, as has been mentioned earlier, it wouldn't only be localization for the domestic market, it's actually localization, but thinking about it more from a regional value chain perspective in SADC, and hopefully also on a continental basis. So I do see some synergy between the desire for localization while still wanting to actively participate in regional and global value chains. So let me stop my remarks there. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you very much, Treaty. I think some really good and interesting points that you bring out there, and I like that you're referencing the particular chapters and where these issues are highlighted. To those that are joining late, there's a link of the book that's been put in the chat. The book is available for free, and you can engage with the various chapters. I think there are lots of interesting questions that are happening in the panel, and I'd like to get to them. But just before we get that, Richard, I wanted to hear your views on basically how this book, which is mostly about South Africa, also speaks more broadly to the middle income country experience. So in other words, what can be learned from the issues that arise in the book by other middle income countries?
Yeah, Pam, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation and congratulations to the various authors of the book. It's a big question, the middle income, in my world at least. There's a kind of general feeling that the international community neglects the problems facing middle income countries. Of course, middle income countries come in various forms, and there's a number of questions in the chat about what is a middle income country and is income the right kind of classification, because there's clearly diversity within that. But I mean, for us at least, in the work we do, thinking about the challenges of that group of countries is very important, given that there has been a tendency to focus on low-income countries and poverty alleviation rather than structural transformation as the kind of central theme of a contemporary development agenda. A couple of points, really. I mean, this is a long-standing debate, right? And it goes back to the beginnings of development thinking. And there are recipes out there, essentially, about how countries move from being rural primary exporters through manufacturing to kind of post-industrial tertiary-based economies. And in conventional thinking, essentially, in one way or another, the market will do that for you. Essentially, I mean, countries with access to cheap labor, if they blend that cheap labor with foreign capital and technology, have access to foreign markets, then somehow that transition through these stages will be automatic. This goes back to the work of Walt Rostow back in the 1960s, but it's true of kind of standard growth models, indeed of more sophisticated endogenous growth models. They all make these assumptions that somehow the market will carry you through these structural transformations. Of course, UNCTAD has never really maintained that. We've always worried about external constraints of one kind or another. Balance of payments constraint is a binding one on many developing countries that makes it difficult to move through these stages of transformation in some sort of automatic fashion. But I think at the heart of it, and it's come out from the presentations, is this question of diversification. This is not diversifying and upgrading the sectors in your economy it cannot be assumed that the market will provide either the resources in terms of productive investment or the incentives to make that kind of transformation, which is why, and I think the book is very clear on this, industrial policy and the ability to do industrial policy, the institutional support for industrial policies is a critical component of any kind of balanced development strategy. And I think the book is very important because that's not just a lesson for South Africa, that's a lesson for, as you said, for many other middle income countries. And, we're at a moment now, having gone through 20 or 30 years in which industrial policy has been dismissed as part of the development policy toolkit, it's now back in fashion. And it's partly back in fashion because advanced countries all of a sudden realize that they need to do industrial policy. Therefore, it becomes legitimate again. But developing countries need to exploit that and understand that the kind of industrial policies that are discussed in the book need to become a central part of any kind of balanced policy. And so that's I think the book is very important for other developing countries in that regard. The other thing that I think comes out strongly from the book is the global context for this, which is it's not just about getting your own institutions and policies right. It's also about contesting the wider global forces that make diversification a difficult challenge, and in some respects a more difficult challenge today than it was even back in the 1960s and 70s when these discussions were also rife among development policy thinkers. And there are 3 or 4 issues, I think, that come out from the book that we need to take very seriously. One is the whole question of the role of global value chains. They're presented as an opportunity because countries can leap into small parts of those chains rather than having to specialize in the production of an entire product. But there's a real danger, given the power imbalances that take place within those chains, that you get stuck producing often the lowest value added parts of those chains, and it's very difficult to diversify out of those into new activities and sectors. And I think that question of how you do that is a very important one that needs further discussion. The second big trend that the book focuses on, and we think it's a critical one in the work that we do, is the growing dominance of finance in shaping both policy outcomes and structural possibilities. And that's not just the rise of the financial sector as being a weightier part of the economy, but it's the way in which financial calculations have also profoundly influenced non-financial corporate behavior through shareholder values, through the use of debt, particularly external debt, as a source of financing, the way that shifts your time horizons, the way that shifts you into focusing on the accumulation of financial assets rather than productive assets. I think the book is very good at exposing that problem. Related to that, and we think this is an important one, the way in which that financialization of the economy has a tendency to suppress aggregate demand at the national and the global level. That makes exporting all the more difficult because it becomes a more competitive environment out there. That benefits large firms and first movers in those markets, and it makes it all the more difficult for many developing countries to benefit from external demand. So that problem of insufficient global demand is a very serious one, I think, that comes out of some of these kinds of structural changes. And lastly, of course, is the role of multilateral rules and institutions and the problem of policy space and the squeezing of policy space, not just in the WTO, although the WTO is a problem, but also still in the behavior of and pressures that come out of the Washington-based financial institutions that also continue, despite all the talk, to promote a very narrow understanding of what a sound economic policy is for developing countries. So I think the book is very good at not only focusing on the internal pressures that need to be overcome for middle-income countries, but this wider global context that can only be defeated, I think, in the end, if developing countries get together and force through changes collectively, rather than hoping that somehow market forces will get them through it.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Richard. I think you're right in that the book really wants to get into the detail of understanding how value is created and captured in different value chains, and what you need to do to be able to create and capture more value as middle-income countries. I think we were really ambitious thinking that we could do all of this in an hour. These conversations, lots of interesting things have come out from Fiona, Trudy, and Richard's remarks about the book that I'd like to explore a little bit further. But I think let's go maybe to some of the questions that have been put in the chat for now. Minister Godongwana, I believe you're back. I think one of the questions that was put in there, and this is not only for the minister, but also for the panelists, was around the differences between structural reform and structural transformation. I think a lot of times in the South African press, these two concepts get conflated. So would you, Minister, be able to give us a view on what it is that is encompassed by the structural reforms and how they differ from the structural transformation that the book is talking about? Minister Godongwana, I think.
Yes, I'm trying to come through. The structural transformation is a far greater and broader concept which relates to changing the structure of the economy. In other words, as we have indicated in my presentation, is the structure of the economy moving for instance, from an agricultural base to an industrial base. That is changing the structure of the economy, whereas structural reforms refers to specific sectoral changes that needs to be done in order to make the economy grow faster. So there's a distinction between these two concepts. The other one is a broader change in the structure of the economy. The other one, you are restructuring, whether it's a specific sector. For instance, if you are talking about transforming the telecommunications sector and so on and so on.
Okay, thank you for that, Minister. Fiona, I'd like to bring you in with regards to the kind of, I mean, the book talks about needing to go on a different path, right, on a different trajectory from now. So with that context, how would you respond to the conceptual differences between structural reforms and structural transformation?
Well, I think they're very different concepts. And I think we've talked a lot about structural transformation. Structural reforms historically were something, sort of neoliberal reforms pushed by the international financial institutions associated with rolling back the state. Obviously, there are a range of reforms that need to be undertaken in the economy, both to enhance or to advance the structural transformation agenda, as well as more broadly. There's huge inefficiencies, and some of them are quite low-hanging fruits. Inefficiencies that need to be unblocked, for example, around spectrum and so on, where it's relatively easy wins. It's things that we should have done to advance a growth agenda. So I guess, for me, the term structural reforms is a bit of a misnomer. Many of what's usually referred to within the ambit of that are not actually structural in nature, and often refer to very different types of interventions.
Absolutely. We've already run out of time, which is really unfortunate, because there are so many other questions in the chat box. I think what we'll try and do is, if some of the questions are by people from the media, we will just download them, or you can also email them to us, and we'll see if we can find a way to get some responses to you with regards to that. I think we are going to close the session now, because we do try to keep to the time that we have committed to. And for this session, we only have an hour, and unfortunately that hour has come to an end. So I would like to close by thanking the panelists for participating, and most importantly, I think the minister, who is very busy, but has found the time to be with us today and to share his views on the book, which have been quite important. But we would not have this book, of course, without the various people that have contributed to it. And firstly, I think I mentioned in the beginning, I had a slide that I'm trying to bring through with the various authors, but just struggling to get it through. Koketsoko, are you able to put it up, please? Can everyone see the slide? Sure. Okay, so we would like to thank the various people that have contributed to the book. I think Trudy and Fiona and Richard have referred to some of the chapters that are written by the people. The book, of course, comes from evidence. Some of the research was done by the Industrial Development Think Tank, which is supported by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and we are very grateful for that support. But some of the research is also research conducted by some of the authors in their individual capacities. So we are very grateful for all those contributions. And also we'd like to acknowledge that some of those contributors are in the launch today. Thank you very much. And then, as well as the endorsements that we've received, I understand that some of the people that have reviewed and endorsed the book are in the launch as well. I'd like to thank, I think I mentioned some of the names in the earlier, and I'd like to mention the others now. We also had endorsements from Mariano Mazzucato from IIP at University College London, and Akebe Okubai, who is in the Ethiopian government. And I mean, it has been very useful to receive these particularly from people that are both academics and practitioners who have been thinking and dealing in detail with a lot of these same issues. In closing, we'd also like to thank, of course, Adam Swallow, who is the commissioning editor from Oxford, who helped us through this process, the OUP production team. I've already mentioned the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, Catherine Garson, who was our editor at the University of Johannesburg, for the support, as well as various academics and practitioners who are in this launch today, who reviewed these chapters and provided very valuable comments that were incorporated in finalizing the book. To everyone that has joined, thank you very much. As mentioned before, the book is available for free on the Oxford University Press website. If you are unable to find it, please do drop an email to Cred or Engage and Sachi on social media, or our email addresses if you have it, and we will be able to share it with you. Thank you very much.